Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Matt Oatway. I'm an analyst on the New York desk here at Genscape. I'm joined with Brian McIntosh, Regional Director of the PJM desk, and Nick Zija, Director of the New York and New England desk. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know we're going to email everyone a copy of the slides after the presentation, and then we'll also be taking questions at the end of the presentation. At any time, if you have a question, you can type it into the question box on the GoToMeeting panel, and then it'll be submitted to us anonymously. So we'll answer all those questions at the end of the presentation. The purpose of this call is to discuss the expected impact of the Hudson Transmission Project on both PJM and New York ISO. So first thing first is we're going to do a quick overview of the project before getting into our specific expectations. In New York specifically, HTP is arguably the single most significant year-over-year change and is the single largest capacity addition to the ISO since Bayonne in 2012. The line has a 660 megawatt capacity and will run from the Bergen substation in PJM to West 49th Street in Zone J. For the time being, power will flow from PJM to New York only. The line is capable of bidirectional flow, but has currently only been approved for one-way transfer. Of the 660 megawatts of capacity, 320 megawatts are firm and 350 megawatts are non-firm. They've included that for losses. The distinction between the firm and the non-firm will be important if we see any TLRs either this summer or going forward. Of the capacity, the New York Power Authority has a 20-year contract for 495 megawatts. Those 495 megawatts include all of the firm capacity and some of the non-firm. Of the remaining capacity, Con Ed owns 100 megawatts, and there's one 66 megawatt block that was purchased in an open season auction by a party that we've not yet identified. We think that understanding who owns the capacity will help us to better predict the behavior of this line, especially in the early days. The line was developed by the same team that developed the Neptune transmission cable and uses the same HVDC technology. The line is under the operational control of PJM for the time being. Also, just a few quick specs. The line's minimum volume is 60 megawatts and max is 660, so we also plan to take that into account. So now we're going to hand it off to Brian, who's going to go through the outlook and expectations for PJM.
Thanks, Matt. So when we look at the PJM side of the HTP line, there's really just a few things that I think are important for understanding the impacts on PSEG and PJM as a whole. The first is, as Matt mentioned, the source point is going to be that Bergen gas unit. We anticipate a good amount more generation coming from that unit. Not necessarily much more during your June, July, and August period because the unit is likely going to get cleared in the day ahead or be called on for a lot of the real-time days. But I think when you get into more of the shoulder months, and there still is the need or the flow of that 600 megawatts out of PJM into New York, there you're going to see more generation from not only Bergen, but you'll also see more generation from units like Linden, possibly Hudson. Some of those gas units a little bit further west, including Bethlehem and Martins Creek. I think you also potentially have the additional capacity at those units and generators because of the higher gas pricing. So there are days where normally a year like last year those units might be cleared without many issues, but in terms of next year or sorry, this coming summer and into the latter part of this year, when those units are maybe a little bit less economical, PJM will end up needing to use them to kind of offset the 600 megawatt loss of exports going into New York. The other piece is on the right. It's a screenshot of the PJM heat map when we got some congestion back about a month ago when we saw some testing on the HTP line. Clearly, just the natural fundamentals is this is a bullish signal to PSEG And when you're taking 660 megawatts out of additional power and pushing it into New York, you're going to need to make up for it somewhere. We're going to get into some of the lessons learned in a second here, but I think just the overall natural outlook that we have is this is a bullish signal for PSEG. We've seen a lot of upside to PSEG over the course of this year. I think that trend probably continues into the summer, and I think this HTP line is a factor in that reasoning. So during the testing this past month, there were a few things that we learned. We did see some pretty significant upside for PSEG, and I think a piece of that was driven by some of the outage season and some of the late season line outages that we had. One was Branchburg to Ramapo, and the other was Roseland to Whippany. Roseland to Whippany had been out since January, and that's one of the main drivers of just the bullish PSEG this year. While Branchburg to Ramapo is a tie line between PJM and New York, and when we took that line out and then started testing more on the HTP, there was just less generation or less capacity available in PSEG there. Now, the impact on the New York interface price from the PJM side of things can be mixed here. We saw both scenarios play out this past month. The first was Reddington-Roseland congestion, which we've seen quite a bit this year. And when you see that bind, you typically see power stepping down at Branchburg and then trying to flow north into northern Jersey. That congestion had a bullish impact on the New York interface price. Reason being, they wanted more generation on the 500 kVs, and they also wanted to incentivize more power to be exported out to New York. Now, the other impact that we saw a little bit later in the month was the Hawthorne to Hinchman Ave and the Fairlawn to Waldwick, and that was more of a bearish impact on the New York interface price. Reason being there is that the Hawthorne to Hinchman and Fairlawn to Waldwick paths tend to be at the end of the Branchburg-Ramapo and are areas where New York will actually flow back into New Jersey on the northern side. And so what you get is when we had some of that flow going out on the HTP line, there was a big pull into Jersey on the New York side, on the northern New Jersey side of things. What resulted is you overloaded the lines that were flowing north to south into PSEG, giving a downside to the New York interface. So the thing to note here is you really need to keep up on your outages in PSEG for the upcoming summer. Any sort of unplanned outage on Branchburg-Ramapo could result in some Reddington-Roseland congestion, which gives you upside, whereas any sort of just strong imports coming in from New York can drive some bearish impact on the New York interface. The other piece that we think is worth noting, we already touched on a little bit, is really monitoring the gas nominations and ramping at plants such as Bergen, Linden, Hudson, and Fairless to gauge what's going on in that region, and then you can really get a feel for how sensitive some of these lines in New Jersey are going to be. The less generation, the more sensitive the lines are going to be, and the more higher likelihood we'll have of some upside congestion at PSEG. In the PJM reports, you can always get the gas nominations for a couple of these units here, and we're also more than happy to talk to any of the PJM customers if you want to know what our assumptions are for the next day for some of the gas units in Jersey. The second piece or the last piece that we want to touch on is just monitoring the day-ahead cleared flow on the HTP. eMarket's been publishing that information. We've noticed in the month of May that there hasn't been a great correlation between what's actually scheduled in the day-ahead and what actually flows in the real time. I think as we get into actual commercial operation starting in the next week or so, I anticipate those flows to match up pretty good. And but I think for the short term here, for the early June, that's something that I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on to make sure that those day-ahead clears are matching up with the actual flows. So those are most of the thoughts on the PJM side of things. We're more than happy to answer any questions about the PJM impacts. And like I said, if you have any other questions, or like Matt said, if you have any questions, you can type them into the box here, and we can address them at the end of the presentation.
On the New York side of things, the fundamental impact is that this line is going to be bearish to Zone J, and that the power being generated in PJM is going to be just a little bit cheaper than what's coming out of New York City. However, the main question that most people are asking us when they're looking into the HTP line is what's going to be the impact on the JG spread. And so in order to answer that question, we decided to look into what's driving the JG spread historically. On the left of this slide, we're showing the historical spread between J and G. You can see it getting smaller. But on the right of the slide, we're showing the historical constraints. Those are the top 15 constraints last summer in terms of cost. Most of those that are in Zone J are on the lower KV system. And so we found that the strength in Zone J and the JG separation is caused by internal J constraints and not constraints between G and J. So the issue isn't moving the power from G down into J. The issue is moving the power around J and from the higher KV lines in J down to the load pockets and down onto and past the 138 KV system. Knowing this, we don't expect HTP to be bearish to the JG spread in any significant way. Instead, we're expecting it to be mildly bearish to both J and G. The generation displaced by HTP flows can be both in J and in G. So that's our main assumption in terms of the spreads and how the HTP line will impact that. Just kind of on that note, the main constraints that we're looking at that have been driving this congestion are not electrically close to the West 49th Street tie-in for the HTP. So the only one that we think could potentially be alleviated by the HTP is the Gowanus to Gethels constraint, or the Gethels to Gowanus constraint. But otherwise, we're not expecting any major shrinking in the JG spread. We also learned a few things from the May testing period, although it was not as conclusive as we would have hoped for. You might have noticed that during the testing period, HTP flows were very bearish to J in the real time. We're chalking that up as being only due to the day-ahead over real-time variance in the line. For the first month or so that the line was testing, it was not scheduled in the day-ahead at all, and it was often running at full. So we were looking at 650 megawatts of real-time only power in the Zone J, and that was extremely bearish. We do not expect that same impact to happen when the line is day-ahead scheduled and other generation is committed around the assumption that the line will be flowing power. In terms of pricing, we're expecting the West 49th Street node to price similar with the Floody 500 megawatt CC node, and then at a premium to the Keystone bus in terms of pricing. That's just looking through the nodal pricing and seeing that it's pricing at the same level. Negative Keystone NYIS spreads and exports to PJM during the testing period, we do not believe were driven by HTP flows. Rather, we believe they were driven by the branch per Gramapo outage that Brian spoke about earlier and the PJM side congestion. The branch per Gramapo outage on the New York side changes the dynamic of the Keystone bus pricing. The Keystone bus prices at an average of all the different lines flowing between PJM and New York ISO. And when branch per Gramapo, one of the largest lines, also one of the highest priced lines being in the east of the state, is out of service, that weighted average goes down significantly. During the branch per Gramapo, the Keystone bus was pricing at or slightly above Zone A. Since branch per Gramapo has returned, we're seeing the Keystone bus price equally between G and A, if not closer to G. And that is the main driver between these PJM AC flows, not the HTP testing. The one unknown that we did not learn from May testing that we're anxious to find out about is to what extent the infrastructure upgrades associated with the HTP construction will alleviate congestion, but in Zone J. We know that the construction of the HTP included a number of transmission upgrades to the Zone J area, many of them on the lower KV system, but we don't know the exact details or specifics of these upgrades and to what extent that they'll impact the congestion in Zone J. So we just wanted to put out a little bit of a disclaimer about that.